Having explored the history and the robes of the Order of the Garter in the last couple of videos, I thought it would be interesting to look very briefly at some of the specific pieces of insignia of the Order of the Garter used by the sovereigns today, items worn by Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and His Majesty the King. I've had one or two questions by email about them. Now, we've seen these items many times before. Not only are they worn at Garter Day in June in Windsor, but also by the sovereign at their coronation, at the state opening of Parliament, and also state banquets. First, let's have a look at a couple of examples of objects that are used as Great Georges, the badge suspended from the Garter collar. If you don't know what a Great George is, go back and watch my earlier video on the robes and insignia of the order. During the coronation of Charles III, when the king left the abbey, he had suspended from his Garter collar what appears to be a diamond-studded Great George. The George was also used in the same way at the coronation of George VI in 1937 and George V in 1911. This object is not really a Great George at all, it is rather an enormous Lesser George that was made to be worn attached to the Garter sash. It has been altered on several occasions in its history, but in its basic form it was made as a Lesser George for King George II and was one of two jewelled Lesser Georges in the King's private collection. George II is shown in this painting wearing the other. The George was given in June of 1749 to the King's grandson, the future King George III, at his installation as a Garter Knight, and it remained part of his Garter insignia for the rest of his life. It is believed that the George was altered and perhaps made richer for King George III in 1765 by a Swiss-born jeweller called John Duval. The Royal Collection believe that the setting of the figure of St George with a pavement of small diamonds may date from that time. The figure may well have been solidly enamelled originally. The face of the figure still is. Originally, the filigree around the central figure was set with 9 brilliant cut diamonds, but in 1857 these were all removed. This work was done by Garrard's, the court jeweller, at the time when Queen Victoria had just lost a large proportion of the Hanoverian jewels to her cousin, the King of Hanover. At that time, this Lesser George may not have been in regular use, and therefore the use of the stones in this object was not a priority, and the large diamonds were recycled for use elsewhere, in the collet necklace or in the regal circlet made for Queen Victoria. Where the larger stones once were, Garrard substituted instead clusters of smaller diamonds, and the George took on its present appearance. Queen Elizabeth II did not use this George at her coronation in 1953. She used a Great George that had been made for King George IV. This Great George, known as the Marlborough George, is set with brilliant cut diamonds and decorated with white, blue and green enamel, and was made by Rundle, Bridge and Rundle, the then court jewellers. It gets its name as it is believed to be a copy of a Great George that was once owned by John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, in the early 18th century. The Marlborough George was used by Edward VII at his coronation in 1902. Elizabeth II not only wore this George at her coronation when leaving Westminster Abbey, but wore it at the state opening of Parliament and for the Garter procession each June. And Charles III appears to be using it in much the same way as his mother, and has been seen wearing it at both the state opening of Parliament and Garter Day in 2023. The royal family have several fabulous Lesser Georges worn with their Garter sashes and a collection of diamond-studded Garter stars. Many of these are very difficult to identify from photographs with any great certainty, as they are personal possessions rather than items within the royal collection. I have seen speculation about these items of insignia on the internet, but I would prefer to say nothing than to draw wrong speculative conclusions. The Garter star worn by Elizabeth II is this, and it may well be the star made for her father George VI when he was made a Garter Knight in 1916. I believe he gave this star to his daughter when, as Princess Elizabeth, she became a Lady of the Garter in 1947. We know that George VI had this very fine garter star made by Garrards in 1947 using a gift of diamonds from South Africa, and I have a sneaky suspicion that this is the star that Charles III is wearing currently. As for Charles III's Lesser George, it has a cameo in it and is enamelled round in blue, and is not dissimilar to the Lesser George made for Queen Mary by Garrards in 1911, although not identical. It also resembles the set, also by Garrards, made for Kaiser Wilhelm in 1877, though the Lesser George of that set is rather larger than the one Charles III wears. Beyond that, the photographic evidence doesn't allow for further speculation. I'm sure someone on here will know more, and I would greatly appreciate any further information you can give. One Lesser George that we saw Her Late Majesty wear quite frequently, which can be seen here in this photo from the state banquet for President Obama in 2011, is a historic piece from the Royal Collection. It has an agate cameo St George at its centre. The cameo is in fact double-sided and has on the reverse an Andrew with his saltire cross, so that it can act as a badge for the Order of the Thistle too. The cameo is set in a gold swivelling frame, and around it are 24 large diamonds that are interspersed with smaller stones, the whole thing suspended from a loop with a diamond-studded bow. This Lesser George was part of the insignia that Queen Victoria gave to Prince Albert on the 8th of February 1840, a couple of days before their wedding. The cameo and the stones were taken from the collection of previous sovereigns. The cameo is the work of Edmund Birch, a well-known gem engraver and Royal Academician, and probably dates from around 1760. It had first been set in a Lesser George for George IV in 1829, but that badge had been broken up at his death in 1830. The brilliant cut diamonds, there are 123 in total, and one rose-cut diamond, were all recycled from the shoulder loop that had belonged to Victoria's grandfather, King George III. This Lesser George was an object that was very dear to Queen Victoria, and from 1863 she wore it often, right up until her death. Subsequent Queens Consort, including Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, wore it too, and it was a favoured item of insignia right through the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Thanks very much for watching.